This is Sid Roth saying, I have a vision. Now is the set time to blow the trumpet in Zion.
Blow a trumpet in Zion, sounding on the mountain. Blow a trumpet in Zion, for the day of the Lord is come.
Shalom, Mishpucha. Shalom, family. Mishpucha is a Hebrew word, and it means family. And we're the Mishpucha, the family with a Jewish heart, made up of Jewish and non-Jewish people that are one new man in the Messiah. Getting ready, Mishpucha, to blow the grandest shofar, the grandest trumpet in Zion. We want everyone, everywhere, to hear the good news. We want everyone, everywhere, to be red hot for the Messiah. And I have on the telephone John McTernan. John spent 26 years in the Internal Security Division of the IRS. He's co-founder of International Cops for Christ. And on October 11th, 1987, he was looking on television and saw a homosexual gathering. And the week following witnessed the greatest one-week stock market decline in the market's history up to that point. And then God supernaturally began to speak to him, told him that he had no fear of God, although if you had asked him a day earlier, do you fear God? He'd say, of course I fear God, but something supernatural happened to him, and he realized he did not have a fear of God, and he realized that there would be direct repercussions to the day of sins that occur in the United States of America. And he began documenting these. He found out that every hurricane that has hit the United States since 1989 has been directly tied to either abortion or homosexuality. And then on yesterday's broadcast, John, we were talking about Gay Pride Day. And it was on June 28th, 1992. Tell me about what occurred.
Yes, Sid, this is the very centerpiece of the book. And if this incident had happened alone, these earthquakes that fell on Gay Pride Day, and I had nothing else but that, I would go around and tell people God's final warning to America. That's how awesome the event is, which I'm about to tell you is. On June 28th, 1992, the very morning of Gay Pride Day, two massive earthquakes occurred in Southern California. One is called the Landers quake. That was 7.6 on the Richter scale. The other was the Bear Mountain quake. That was 6.5. But we're going to zero in on the Landers quake. That was the fourth greatest earthquake, last century. I almost said this century, but last century to hit the United States. And remember now, there was only a handful of earthquakes that hit the United States 7.0 or greater on the Richter scale. I mean, that's a massive earthquake. And there's only a handful of days that are Gay Pride Day, and the chances of them falling together are infinitesimal. But it happened. And it shook Southern California. In fact, when you look at the newspaper articles, the Los Angeles Times of that day, the headline is the front page. All that's on the front page is the Gay Pride March, and all the rest is about the earthquakes and the damage done by the earthquakes. And it's interesting when you look at that article about the homosexual parade. It said that they had to brave the earthquakes to march. And God's word says he destroys nations. Leviticus chapter 18 says he destroys nations that promote homosexuality. Well, what happened, Sid, was shortly afterwards, and God just got this to me. I mean, I don't sit down and read scientific journals, but I was in the waiting room in a doctor's office, and here was a scientific journal called Earth. And on it had the Landers quake. And I began to read this article, and literally I was astonished. My jaw dropped, because of all the earthquakes that have ever occurred, Sid, that have been studied by seismologists, this particular one, Landers quake, was different than every other earthquake. And remember, this was on the very morning of Gay Pride Day. So I start to read this article, and this is why this is the centerpiece of the book. This article went on to say that no other earthquake, this earthquake was unique in the history of studying earthquakes. Number one, it jumped from fault to fault, gaining power. Normally, it runs one fault, an earthquake, and stops. But this one was jumping from fault to fault to fault, getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and then it just stopped. It was just, they don't know why, but it just stopped. And on top of it, what made this so unique in the history of studying earthquakes, it set off earthquakes 800 miles away. This was mind-boggling to the scientists. This is the first time that they ever were able to document that an earthquake in one location set earthquakes off in 800 miles away. That earthquake set off about 15 to 20 earthquakes throughout the western section of the United States, instantly following the Landers quake. It shook two volcanic mountains in northern California, Mount Shasta and Mount Lassen. Literally, the entire western section of the United States on the morning of Gay Pride Day was ringing like a bell. We nearly said, this is how important this is. If God didn't stop this earthquake from gaining in strength, it was right next to the San Andreas Fault. This earthquake was almost bordering the big San Andreas Fault, the one that if it ever went could level California. And it set 4.0 and 5.0 earthquakes all over the western section of the United States. Well, Sid, imagine what would have happened if this earthquake didn't stop at 7.6 and it continued on towards the San Andreas Fault. And these earthquakes throughout the western section of the United States, instead of being 5.0s, they were 7 and 8.0. And Denver came down, and Phoenix came down, and Salt Lake City came down, and the railroad and all the roads were broken, and the conduits, and Los Angeles, Southern California was leveled. We would have been finished as a nation. We would have had millions of people injured, dead, refugees. How would we ever provide for them? I mean, we were on the verge of, on Gay Pride Day, June 28, 1992, with that earthquake and triggering all those earthquakes in the western section of the United States. We were on the verge of God, as far as I'm concerned, calling an end, bringing like a huge judgment and calling an end to us as a nation.
John, the title of your book, God's Final Warning to America. What do you mean by that? I mean, I understand English. Is this God's final warning, the things you've accumulated in your book, that every sin America does, you can correlate a tragedy of an earthquake or the stock market going down? Or, I mean, you've done this on so many events. How much longer do we have of these warning judgments?
Sid, I believe in all my heart that we're out of time. God in His grace has given us warning after warning after warning. And the church has failed to respond. Sid, I believe these warnings are for the church to put it together. And we're not, Sid. For some reason, we're not responding, Sid. And I can go into my personal reason for believing it or for telling you why I don't think the church is responding. But we're out of time. God has warned us that the judgments are getting more and more severe. They're coming more and more frequently. We're really receiving tremendous warnings now over Israel and pushing Israel over.
All right, you raised an important question. This is in Chapter 2 of your book, the Israel Connection. Explain that.
Sid, I saw the connection between abortion and homosexuality in 1987.
As far as judgment,
right.
When anything to do with abortion or homosexuality occurs, the same day, Mishpacha, a judgment hits America. But what about Israel?
Well, Sid, I first noticed Israel. Do you remember Hurricane Andrew?
Of course.
Hurricane Andrew was natural disaster ever to hit the United States. It was literally like a 30-mile wide tornado. It leveled whole areas of southern Florida. Hundreds of thousands of homes were damaged and destroyed. And, of course, it then went into Louisiana and did damage there also. Now, if you look, and I have this, I saved this newspaper, USA Today, for that day in August of, that was August of 92. Yes, that was August of 92. On the front page, it's all Hurricane Andrew. And on the bottom right-hand side, it talks about the Madrid peace process meets for the first time in Washington. That's all that's on the front page of that newspaper is all the destruction by Hurricane.
Okay, what was the sin of the Madrid Peace Conference?
The Madrid Peace Conference was really just a code word for Israel to give up Jerusalem, or at least parts of Jerusalem, and good parts of the covenant land. It was, quote, peace for Israel to give away land to Syria and to form a Palestinian nation. The day the Madrid peace process was transferred from Spain and they met for the first time in the United States, that's when Hurricane Andrew hit. You can look on, if anybody has access to a library and they have the USA Today, you can go back to August of 1992 and you will see on the front page everything about Hurricane Andrew and an article about the Madrid peace process. And my eyes, Sid, I can still remember to this day, I was scanning it, I was looking at Hurricane Andrew, and then I caught the Madrid peace process. And I looked up, and I looked down, and I looked up, and I said, we've fallen under judgment.
Is there any correlation? Because at that time, President Bush Sr. was president, and he had one of the highest approval ratings of any president in history, and then most people were shocked that he lost to President Clinton. Is there any correlation between the two?
Yes, Sid. If there's one thing I wish I could go back and I should have done in listening to the Lord, this is it. I was following as former President Bush I use the word bullying Israel in the United Nations over resolutions. And there was about 6 or 8 resolutions that were promoted by the Bush administration condemning Israel over what was going on with the land there in 1991, 92. And I would see the resolution, and I would hear President Bush condemn Israel. And then a week later, there would be a poll out, and his popularity was coming down. It was coming down. Now, to me, I was watching this, and I was saying, oh, no, he's forcing Israel, and God's going to remove him. God's going to remove him. And I remember telling people that. I remember going around.
Whoops, we're out of time. Mishbook, I'll pick up right here on tomorrow's broadcast, but pick up this book. Write us today or call our 800 number, God's Final Warning to America, $14 postage paid. All the documentation of what you're hearing us discuss.
If you would like to receive a complimentary copy of our bi-monthly teaching newsletter, cassette catalog, or information about becoming Mishpocha, write to me, Sid Roth, Post Office Box 1918, Brunswick, Georgia, 31521. Or call our order-only line, 1-800-548-1918. To place a credit card order, call anytime, 1-800-548-1918. For all other calls, the number is 912-265-2500. That's 912-265-2500. For a cassette tape of this week's broadcast, send $5 to Sid Roth, Post Office Box 1918, Brunswick, Georgia, 31521. Look us up on the web, www.sidroth.org. That's www.sidroth.org.